My name is Elysia Hart. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me with the same three words: calm, reliable, and easy to overlook. I live in a quiet suburb outside Seattle, where the houses are close enough to hear your neighbor's lawnmower, but far enough apart that everyone pretends not to notice each other's problems. I work as a financial compliance analyst, which is a long way of saying I spend my days reading details that most people skim past: the tiny numbers, the footnotes, the things that don't quite add up. In my professional world, that habit makes me valuable. In my personal life, it made me invisible. For 20 years, I was married to a man named Daniel. To most people, we looked like the kind of couple you see in holiday cards: steady, predictable, uncomplicated. We hosted Thanksgiving. We remembered birthdays. We attended the same neighborhood barbecues every summer. And if you asked our friends to describe me, they probably would have said something like, "Elysia's wonderful. She keeps everything running," which sounds like a compliment. But over time, I realized it was more of a description of a function than a person. I wasn't the loud one at the table. I wasn't the dramatic one in the room. I certainly wasn't the one anyone expected to change the course of a conversation. I was the one who listened, the one who noticed, the one who remembered. And if there's one thing you learn when people underestimate you, it's this: they stop hiding things. That's how this story began. Not with a fight, not with a betrayal anyone could see coming, and certainly not with the kind of explosive moment that movies like to show. It began with a gift. A beautifully wrapped present that my husband placed in front of me on the night of our 20th wedding anniversary. At first glance, it looked thoughtful, elegant even. The kind of gift a husband gives when he wants to prove he's been paying attention after 2 decades together. Everyone at the restaurant thought so, but there was one small detail on the gift tag. Just a few words. A detail so small that no one else at the table noticed it. No one except the woman who had spent 20 years making a career out of reading what other people overlook. Me. And the moment I saw it, I understood something about my marriage that I had somehow managed to miss for 2 decades. The dinner continued. People laughed. Wine glasses clinked. But from that moment on, I knew that our anniversary would become something none of us would ever forget. Not because of a scene, not because of revenge, but because sometimes the quietest realization is the one that changes everything. And the strangest part? No one at that table realized that the balance in our lives had already begun to shift. Slowly. Silently. Irreversibly. Before I tell you what happened that night, though, you need to understand who I was to them. Because the way people see you often determines what they think they can get away with. But I'm curious about something first. Have you ever had a moment where a tiny detail revealed a truth you couldn't unsee? If you had asked anyone in our circle to describe me 20 years ago, the answers would have sounded almost identical. Elysia's the dependable one. She keeps things organized. She's so easy to get along with. None of those things was wrong. They were just incomplete. I met Daniel when I was 22. During my final year of college. He was charismatic in the way some people are without trying. The kind of man who could walk into a room and somehow end up at the center of it within 10 minutes. People laughed louder around him. Stories seemed more interesting when he told them. Even waiters remembered his name. Standing next to him, I often felt like the quiet outline of a drawing. Present, but rarely the focus. At the time, that didn't bother me. In fact, I thought it worked perfectly. Daniel thrived in attention. I thrived in observation. He spoke quickly and confidently. I preferred to think before I said anything at all. Where he filled space, I noticed details. For a long time, that difference felt like a balance. Our friends seemed to agree. At parties, Daniel would tell stories while I refilled drinks or helped clear the table. If someone forgot an anniversary date or needed help organizing a fundraiser, I was the one they called. Not because I was the most exciting person in the room, but because I was the most reliable. And reliability, I eventually learned, has a strange side effect. People start assuming you will always be there. They stop asking if you mind. They stop checking if something is fair. They simply expect. In the early years of our marriage, those expectations felt small. Daniel worked in commercial real estate, which meant long hours and constant networking. Clients needed dinners. Deals required weekend golf games. There were always people to meet and relationships to maintain. So I became the quiet infrastructure behind his life. I handled the bills, remembered birthdays, sent thank you notes, kept track of family obligations. If Daniel's parents visited, I arranged the guest room. If friends came over, I planned the meal. And every once in a while, someone would smile at Daniel and say something like, "You're lucky. Elysia takes such good care of everything." He always agreed. But the interesting thing about compliments like that is what they don't include. No one asked what I wanted, not in a cruel way, not deliberately. It was simply understood that my role was already defined. Reliable, supportive, quiet. The truth is, I helped create that image myself. I didn't argue when Daniel made decisions quickly. I didn't interrupt when people spoke over me at dinner. And I didn't correct anyone who assumed my ambitions were smaller than they actually were. Because on the surface, my life looked stable. I had a respected job in financial compliance. I worked with regulations, audits, and contract language, fields that required patience and attention to detail. Skills that rarely make for interesting small talk at a party. So most people didn't ask much about my work. They simply assumed it was the kind of job that fit a woman who preferred staying in the background. What they didn't realize was that my job trained me to notice patterns, tiny inconsistencies, small things that didn't quite match the story people were telling. Over time, that habit extended into my personal life. I noticed who interrupted whom, who forgot to say thank you, who took credit for someone else's effort. And while I rarely commented on those things out loud, I remembered them. Not out of bitterness, just observation. For 20 years, that was the role I played in our world. The steady presence, the quiet listener, the person everyone trusted to keep things running smoothly. And when people grow comfortable with that version of you, something subtle happens. They begin to assume you will never change. Which is why the first real crack in that assumption didn't look dramatic at all. In fact, most people in the room didn't even notice it. But I did. Because small moments, the ones everyone else ignores, are often where the truth begins. And the first one happened during something as ordinary as a dinner with friends. The first moment that stayed with me happened during a dinner party at our house about 8 years into our marriage. It wasn't a special occasion. Just one of those casual evenings Daniel liked to host for colleagues and friends. A few people from his real estate office, a couple we'd known since college, and 2 neighbors who lived down the street. 7 people around the table. The kind of night where wine flows a little too easily, and conversations overlap until no one quite remembers who started which story. I had spent most of the afternoon preparing the meal. Nothing extravagant, roasted salmon, a salad with citrus and fennel, and a simple lemon tart I'd learned to make from my mother. By the time everyone arrived, the house smelled warm and bright. The candles were lit. Music hummed softly from the kitchen speaker. Daniel walked in last, still on a phone call with a client. That wasn't unusual. He finished the call, greeted everyone with his usual energy, and poured himself a drink before sitting down at the head of the table. Dinner began with the comfortable rhythm these evenings always had. People asked about work. Someone told a story about a disastrous property showing. Laughter bounced around the room like it always did when Daniel was in his storytelling mood. At some point, someone complimented the food. "Daniel, this is fantastic," one of his coworkers said, lifting his fork with an appreciative smile. "You really know how to host." Daniel grinned. "Thanks," he said easily. It was a small moment. So small that no one paused to think about it. Not one person at the table corrected the assumption. And Daniel didn't either. The conversation continued as if the compliment had landed exactly where it was supposed to. I remember sitting there, holding my fork halfway to the plate. Not offended, not even surprised. Just aware. Because the truth was, Daniel probably hadn't thought about it at all. The compliment had simply drifted toward him, and he accepted it the same way people accept a passing breeze, without examining where it came from. Across the table, our neighbor Rachel glanced at me briefly and smiled in a way that felt polite but distant, like someone acknowledging a background detail in a photograph. I smiled back. Then I continued eating. That was the moment I realized something subtle about the way people saw me. I wasn't the person who created the evening. I was part of the setting, like the candles, or the music, or the lemon tart sitting quietly in the center of the table. Necessary, perhaps, but not the focus. The strange thing is, I didn't feel angry about it. Not yet. Instead, I found myself doing what I always did, observing, because moments like that reveal more than the words themselves. They show you the default assumptions people carry about your place in the room. Later that night, after everyone left and the dishes were stacked beside the sink, Daniel walked into the kitchen. "That went well," he said, loosening his tie. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "It did." He kissed the top of my head as he walked past me toward the living room. "Thanks for helping tonight." Helping. I rinsed a wineglass under the warm water and watched the bubbles slide slowly down the drain. It wasn't the word itself that lingered. It was how naturally it came to him, as if the evening had been his, and I had simply assisted. Again, I didn't argue. I didn't point it out. I didn't even mention it the next day. But that moment settled somewhere quiet in my memory. Because small details like that tend to reveal something important over time. Not through a single event, but through repetition. And once you notice the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. If that dinner party had been the only time something like that happened, I probably would have forgotten about it within a week. But the thing about small cuts is that they rarely stay isolated. They repeat. Quietly. Casually. Almost invisibly. And over time, they start to feel normal. A few months after that dinner, Daniel and I attended a charity fundraiser hosted by one of his clients. It was held in a large glass-walled event space overlooking the water. White tablecloths, soft jazz music. The kind of event where people hold wine glasses carefully while discussing market trends and vacation homes. I wore a simple navy dress that evening, something understated but elegant. Daniel introduced me to people the way he always did. "This is my wife, Elysia." Then the conversation would shift back to him, to his deals, his projects, his connections. I didn't mind that part. Networking events were never really about spouses anyway. Most partners simply smiled, nodded, and filled the quiet gaps while business conversations unfolded. But later that night, something else happened. We were standing with a group of 4 people, 2 of Daniel's colleagues and a couple who had recently moved to the city. The woman, Meredith, asked what I did for work. "Financial compliance," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "Oh," she said politely, the way people do when they're not quite sure what that means. Before I could explain further, Daniel laughed lightly. "Elysia reads contracts for fun," he said. "She probably enjoys tax forms." Everyone chuckled. It wasn't cruel laughter, just easy social laughter, the kind people use to smooth over awkward pauses. I smiled because that was the expected response. But the truth was, Daniel's comment had quietly shifted the room. Instead of curiosity about my work, it framed it as a kind of harmless eccentricity, a quirky little detail about the quiet wife. No one asked another question. The conversation drifted back toward real estate markets and investment opportunities. And again, I let it go. Not because I agreed with him, but because correcting someone in a room like that can feel strangely disruptive, like interrupting a performance everyone else is enjoying. So I stayed silent. And silence, over time, has an interesting side effect. It becomes part of the story people tell about you. After enough moments like that, Daniel's version of me became the default. The quiet one, the organized one, the one who handled details behind the scenes. Even Daniel began to believe it more fully. I could see it in small, everyday interactions. When friends asked about financial decisions, Daniel answered first, even though I managed most of our investments. When people complimented the house, he spoke about renovations, even though I had spent months researching contractors and budgets. Again, none of it felt like a deliberate attempt to erase me. That's what made it so easy to overlook. It was simply the momentum of assumptions, and the longer those assumptions existed, the more natural they felt. Even to me. There's a moment that stands out in my memory from around that time. Daniel and I were driving home one evening after meeting friends for drinks. The car was quiet except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional glow of passing streetlights. "You know," he said casually, "people always say how calm you are." I looked out the window. "What do they mean by that?" He shrugged slightly. "I don't know. You just don't get bothered by things." I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I did notice things. I noticed them very clearly. I simply chose not to react in ways people expected. But what Daniel, and everyone else, interpreted as calmness was often something else entirely. Observation, memory, and patience. Because when small moments repeat long enough, they stop feeling accidental. They start forming a pattern, and patterns, once you see them clearly, become impossible to ignore. The interesting part is that by the time I fully recognized the role people had assigned me, I had already been playing it for years, reliably, quietly, almost perfectly, until the day I realized exactly what that role was supposed to be. It took me a long time to understand that the role people see you in often has less to do with who you are, and more to do with what makes their lives easier. For Daniel, my role was simple. I was the steady background that allowed him to move freely in the foreground. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came through a series of ordinary moments that slowly arranged themselves into something clearer. One of those moments happened during a Sunday afternoon visit with Daniel's parents. They lived about 40 minutes away, in a quiet neighborhood where every lawn looked almost identical. We visited them once or twice a month, usually for lunch. Daniel's mother, Carol, had always been polite to me. Not warm exactly, but polite in the way someone is when they approve of your usefulness. That afternoon, we were sitting around the dining table after the meal. Daniel's father was talking about a recent property investment, and Daniel had started explaining some details about financing structures. At one point, Carol looked at him with a proud smile. "You've always been so good with money," she said. Daniel nodded modestly. Across the table, I took a sip of tea. For the past 12 years, I had been the one managing nearly every financial detail in our household. Investments, retirement accounts, tax planning. Daniel preferred focusing on his work and trusting that I handled the rest. But in that room, the narrative was different. Daniel was the one naturally skilled with finances. Carol continued. "Elysia's lucky to have someone like you keeping everything organized." There was a small pause at the table, not long enough to feel awkward. Just long enough that Daniel could have said something like, "Actually, Elysia manages most of that." But he didn't. Instead, he smiled in that easy, agreeable way he had. "Well," he said lightly, "we make a good team." The conversation moved on. And once again, the assumption remained intact. Later that evening, while we were driving home, I thought about how many times moments like that had happened. Not just with his parents, with friends, with colleagues, even with neighbors who assumed Daniel handled things he had never once looked at. And gradually, something began to crystallize in my mind. The role people had given me wasn't just quiet or reliable. It was supporting infrastructure. I was the person who made everything function smoothly without drawing attention to the mechanisms. If Daniel's career moved forward, I helped stabilize the life around it. If social gatherings ran well, I handled the details. If financial decisions worked out, the success was attributed to our teamwork, which, on the surface, sounded fair. But teamwork only truly exists when both people are seen. And that evening, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. In most people's eyes, Daniel was the story. I was the context. And once a role like that settles into place, people stop questioning it. They rely on it. They build expectations around it. They begin to assume that no matter what happens, you will continue performing that role exactly the same way, quietly, dependably, without interruption. For a long time, I allowed that assumption to remain untouched, partly because confronting it felt unnecessary, and partly because I believed something else. That recognition didn't matter as much as stability. But roles, especially invisible ones, have a strange effect over time. The longer you play them, the easier it becomes for others to forget you ever had a different identity. And the more comfortable they grow, relying on something they barely notice. By the time I fully understood the role I had been assigned, everyone around me had already accepted it as permanent, including Daniel. Which is why the moment everything shifted didn't happen during an argument, or a betrayal, or a dramatic confrontation. It happened in a quiet place, during an ordinary moment when no one else was even present. A moment that made me see my own life a little more clearly than I ever had before. The moment everything shifted didn't happen in front of other people. There was no dinner party, no awkward silence at a table, no comment that needed correcting. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in my office. My job, as I mentioned earlier, revolves around details, contracts, regulatory documents, and financial disclosures. The kind of paperwork most people glance at quickly before signing. But I read everything slowly, carefully. That day, I was reviewing a compliance report for a client whose numbers didn't quite align with their filings. It was routine work, the kind I had done hundreds of times before, column by column, line by line. Somewhere in the middle of that process, I paused. Not because of the report, because of a thought that arrived unexpectedly. I had spent the morning analyzing someone else's financial structure, tracking how assets moved, how responsibilities were divided, how protections were built into legal language. And suddenly, I realized something strange. I had never applied the same level of attention to my own life. Daniel and I had been married for more than 15 years at that point. We shared a house, joint accounts, long-term investments. On paper, everything was stable. But stability and clarity are not the same thing. So that afternoon, during a quiet moment between meetings, I opened a folder on my computer where I kept our personal financial documents, mortgage statements, investment summaries, insurance policies. Again, nothing unusual. Most couples have some version of this archive somewhere. But as I read through the files, really read them, the way I read contracts at work, I noticed something I had never fully considered before. Almost every decision in our financial lives has been made quickly. Not carelessly, just quickly. Daniel would suggest something, an investment opportunity, a new account, a change in strategy, and I would review the details afterward. Usually, everything checked out. But the pattern itself was interesting. Daniel initiated. I verified. He acted. I stabilized. It mirrored the dynamic that existed in every other part of our lives. And for the first time, I asked myself a question that felt strangely overdue. If I weren't the one initiating decisions, what exactly was my position in the structure we had built together? I kept scrolling through documents, account authorizations, beneficiary designations, property paperwork. And while nothing looked alarming, something about the overall arrangement felt uneven. Not dangerous, just unexamined. The kind of structure that works perfectly well as long as nothing ever changes. But life rarely stays that predictable. That afternoon, I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Outside the office window, rain had started falling softly across the parking lot. Seattle rain, light enough that people barely bothered with umbrellas. For several minutes, I just watched it, because the realization forming in my mind wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anger or betrayal. It was something quieter. Clarity. For years, I had assumed my silence meant patience, that my role as the steady one simply balanced Daniel's more visible presence. But the truth was simpler than that. I had allowed an entire structure, financial, emotional, social, to form around the assumption that I would always remain exactly where I was. Reliable, supportive, unquestioning. And the strange part? No one had forced that structure into place. I had simply never paused long enough to evaluate it. Until that Tuesday afternoon. That was the day I started asking questions. Not out loud, not to Daniel, not to anyone else, just to myself. Questions about how our life actually worked. Questions about what protections existed and what didn't. Questions about what would happen if the quiet person in the background decided to examine the entire system more closely. And once those questions appeared, I realized something important. Silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it just means someone is still gathering information. Because when you spend enough time reading details other people ignore, you eventually learn something valuable. The truth rarely hides in dramatic moments. It hides in structures. And structures reveal themselves only to people patient enough to study them. That Tuesday afternoon was the first time I looked at my own life the way I looked at a financial report. Carefully, methodically, without assumptions. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make any immediate decisions. But something inside me had shifted. And once a shift like that begins, it quietly changes how you see everything that follows. After that Tuesday afternoon, nothing in my life changed on the surface. Daniel still left early for work most mornings. We still met friends for dinner on weekends. Bills were still paid on time. Holiday cards still went out every December. From the outside, our lives looked exactly the same. But inside my own mind, something had shifted in a very specific way. Before that day, my silence had mostly been a habit. After that day, it became a choice. There's a subtle but important difference between the two. Habitual silence is passive. Chosen silence is observational. Once I began looking at our life more deliberately, I started noticing things I had previously dismissed as normal background noise. For example, Daniel liked making quick financial decisions when he was excited about something. A new investment opportunity. A partnership in a commercial development. A recommendation from a colleague. He would mention it casually over dinner. I'm thinking of putting some money into this project. Then he would outline the basics: location, expected returns, timeline. Before, I would respond the way I always had. That sounds interesting. And later, I would quietly check the details. But now, instead of simply verifying after the fact, I began asking questions. Not confrontational ones, just careful ones. What's the ownership structure? Who else is involved? How are liabilities divided? Daniel usually answered quickly, sometimes with mild amusement. "You really do love the fine print," he'd say. I would smile. But I noticed something interesting. He rarely asked the same kinds of questions himself. Daniel operated comfortably at the level of momentum, trusting relationships, instincts, and opportunities. I operated differently. I trusted the documentation. Over the next few months, I started reviewing our shared financial structure with a level of attention I had previously reserved only for work. Joint accounts, investment allocations, property ownership, insurance coverage. Again, nothing alarming appeared, but I did notice that many things were organized in ways that favored simplicity rather than protection, which made sense. Most couples assume the partnership itself is the protection, And for many years, I had believed that too. But once you begin examining a structure closely, you start recognizing its vulnerabilities. Not necessarily because someone intends harm, but because people rarely design systems to withstand the unexpected. One evening, about 3 months after that Tuesday afternoon, Daniel and I were sitting on the couch watching television. He mentioned another potential investment, something involving a mixed-use development outside the city. "It's early," he said casually, "but it could turn into something big." In the past, I might have simply nodded. This time I asked a few more questions than usual. Nothing dramatic, just specifics. After a moment, Daniel glanced at me with a small smile. "You've been extra curious about this stuff lately." "Occupational habit," I said lightly. He shrugged and returned his attention to the television. From his perspective, nothing had changed. My questions were just another small detail about my personality. But from my perspective, something very important was happening. I was no longer reacting to the structure of our life. I was mapping it. Every account, every document, every decision-making pattern. In the same way, a compliance analyst studies an organization before evaluating its risk exposure. Quietly, patiently, without announcing the process. And because everyone around me had grown so comfortable with my silence over the years, no one suspected that it now had a very different purpose. They still saw the same person they had always seen, the calm one, the reliable one, the woman who listened more than she spoke. What they didn't realize was that listening had become a form of preparation. Because when you stop reacting emotionally to small moments of dismissal, something interesting happens. You gain distance, and distance allows you to see patterns that other people never notice. Patterns in how decisions are made, patterns in how credit is given, patterns in what people assume you will tolerate forever. Over time, those patterns begin forming a kind of map. And once you have a map, you can start planning a different route. Not dramatically, not loudly, just carefully. The way someone moves when they finally understand the terrain they've been standing on for years. That was the stage my life had quietly entered. The observation stage. The preparation stage. The stage where silence is no longer weakness. It's a strategy. And while everyone else continued assuming that nothing had changed, they were missing something important. Because the quietest shifts often happen long before anyone notices their consequences. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. In movies, change often begins with a single decisive action. Someone storms out of a room, confronts a problem head-on, and declares that everything will be different from now on. Real life tends to move more quietly than that. In my case, preparation looked like ordinary evenings at the dining table with a laptop open in front of me. Daniel assumed I was working late. Sometimes I was, but more often, I was studying the structure of our shared life the way an auditor studies a company. Not searching for wrongdoing, just understanding how everything actually worked. I began with the simplest questions. What assets were legally shared? What responsibilities were attached to each account? What decisions required both signatures? And which ones could be made independently? Most couples never need to ask these questions in detail. Trust fills in the spaces where documentation feels unnecessary. But trust and clarity are not the same thing. And clarity, once you begin seeking it, tends to expand. Over several weeks, I created a personal record. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet outline stored in a password-protected file. Properties, investment accounts, insurance policies, retirement funds. I wasn't discovering secrets. Everything had technically been available all along. The difference was that I was now seeing the full picture instead of isolated pieces. And the full picture revealed something subtle. Daniel handled momentum. I handled stability. His decisions initiated movement. My work ensured the movement didn't collapse. That dynamic had worked smoothly for years. But it also meant something else. If the structure ever shifted unexpectedly, I was the person most capable of understanding how to adjust it. Not because I had more authority, but because I had more information. Around that time, I also started paying closer attention to conversations. Not just what people said, but what they assumed. At dinners with friends, Daniel often described upcoming projects with excitement. People admired his ambition, his instincts, and his willingness to take risks. No one asked about the systems behind those risks, and Daniel never mentioned them. That wasn't arrogance. It was simply a perspective. He saw the visible part of the structure. I saw the framework holding it together. One evening, about 6 months after my quiet review had begun, we attended another dinner with friends. Halfway through the meal, someone asked Daniel how he managed the stress of large investments. Daniel laughed. "You learn to trust your gut," he said. The table nodded approvingly. I took a sip of water and listened. Because instinct might guide decisions, but systems determine consequences. Later that night, after we returned home, Daniel went upstairs to answer a few emails. I stayed in the kitchen, reviewing a document I had printed earlier that day. It was one of our investment summaries. Again, nothing alarming. But I had begun noticing small patterns in how some opportunities were structured. Patterns that made sense for someone comfortable with risk, less so for someone responsible for long-term stability. That evening, I made a quiet adjustment. Nothing dramatic. Just a decision to start separating certain responsibilities more clearly. Not emotionally. Logically. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor the following week. Not someone Daniel usually worked with, but a compliance-focused specialist I trusted professionally. When Daniel asked where I was going that morning, I answered honestly. Just reviewing some long-term planning. He nodded without much interest. That was another thing people underestimated about quiet individuals. When you rarely create conflict, others assume your actions will always remain within familiar boundaries. The idea that you might be evaluating the entire structure of your life rarely crosses their minds. Over the next few months, those small reviews continued. Account structures, ownership documents, legal protections. Everything remained calm on the surface. Friends still came over for dinner. Daniel still pursued new opportunities. Nothing outwardly suggested that anything had changed, but internally, the map I had been building became clearer. Every asset, every responsibility, every point where decisions intersect. And as that map developed, one realization became impossible to ignore. The stability of our shared life depended heavily on someone quietly managing the details. Someone is reading every document, someone anticipating risks before they became visible. For years, that person had been me. And because the role had always been invisible, no one had ever questioned what would happen if I stopped performing it the same way. Not Daniel, not our friends, not even his parents, who believed he naturally handled everything. They had all accepted a simple story about how our lives worked. Daniel led, Elysia supported, reliable, quiet, permanent. But the more clearly I saw the structure behind that story, the more I understood something important. Roles only remain permanent as long as the person performing them agrees to continue. And for the first time in 20 years, I was beginning to consider what it might look like if I chose differently. Not impulsively, not angrily, just carefully. Because preparation isn't about revenge. It's about clarity. And clarity eventually leads to decisions. The next step in my story began the day that clarity revealed something I hadn't been expecting to find. Not a betrayal, not a lie, but a piece of information that changed how I understood everything else. A discovery I made completely by accident, in a place Daniel probably assumed I would never think to look. The discovery didn't happen during one of my planned reviews. In fact, it happened on a completely ordinary Saturday morning. Daniel had left early for a golf outing with 2 business partners. I stayed home, enjoying the quiet rhythm of the house when no one else was around. Coffee on the kitchen counter. The soft hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. I had planned to spend the morning organizing a few files. Nothing dramatic. Just the small maintenance tasks that tend to accumulate when life moves quickly. One of those tasks involved scanning a stack of physical documents that had been sitting in a folder in the office cabinet. Old statements, tax confirmations, and property summaries. As I worked through the pile, I noticed an envelope addressed to Daniel from a law firm whose name I didn't immediately recognize. That wasn't unusual. Daniel occasionally consulted attorneys when structuring investment partnerships. Still, the letter had been filed with personal documents rather than business ones. Curiosity isn't the right word for what I felt. Professional instinct might be closer. So I opened it. Inside was a short confirmation notice about a recently drafted legal document. The letter itself was routine. Formal language, brief explanation, standard closing remarks. But one line near the middle caught my attention. It referenced a trust document. Specifically, a personal asset trust was established within the last year. That by itself wasn't alarming. Many people create trusts for tax efficiency or long-term planning. But as I continued reading, something about the wording felt slightly unusual. The trust referenced assets not included in our joint portfolio summaries. Again, not necessarily suspicious. Daniel occasionally participated in smaller side investments with colleagues, but the letter also included the name of the beneficiary designation, and that name was not mine. For a moment, I simply stared at the page. Not with shock, more with the quiet focus that appears when a puzzle piece suddenly doesn't match the rest of the picture. The beneficiary listed was someone named Lauren Ellis. The name meant nothing to me. Not a family member, not a known colleague, just a name attached to a legal structure involving assets I hadn't previously seen documented in our shared records. I sat down at the dining table and read the letter again, then a third time. There were no emotional conclusions rushing through my mind, just questions. What assets were involved? Why had this structure been created? And why had Daniel chosen to store the document among personal records rather than business ones? It's important to explain something here. At that moment, I didn't assume betrayal. After years of working in compliance, I had learned that incomplete information can easily lead to incorrect interpretations. Instead of reacting emotionally, I did what I always do when something doesn't align with the rest of the structure. I started gathering context. The letter included a reference number for the trust. That number allowed me to locate additional filings through publicly available records. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. Just documentation that most people would never think to examine. Over the next hour, I quietly reviewed what I could access. The trust had been established roughly 11 months earlier. The listed assets were tied to an investment partnership connected to one of Daniel's development projects. Again, not unusual, but the beneficiary designation remained the same. Lauren Ellis, and according to the document, the trust transferred ownership rights to that beneficiary under specific future conditions. I leaned back in the chair and folded the letter carefully. Still no anger, just clarity slowly forming. Because, regardless of the explanation behind it, one fact was undeniable. Daniel had created a financial structure involving assets that existed completely outside the systems we had built together, and he had never mentioned it. That realization didn't feel explosive. It felt quiet, like discovering a hidden room in a house you've lived in for years. Not necessarily dangerous, but undeniably significant. For several minutes, I simply sat there, looking at the document on the table. Then I placed it back into the envelope and returned it to the folder exactly where I had found it. No confrontation, no immediate questions, because I understood something important. Information, by itself, is not power. Context is. And I didn't yet have enough context to fully understand what I had discovered. But I did know one thing. The map I had been building of our life together had just revealed a section I hadn't previously seen. a section connected to someone whose name had never once appeared in any of our conversations. Lauren Ellis. I finished scanning the rest of the documents that morning, as if nothing unusual had happened. The house remained quiet. The coffee cooled in my cup. Outside, a neighbor walked past with their dog. An ordinary Saturday. But internally, something had shifted again. Because the moment you discover that a structure contains hidden components, you begin asking a different set of questions. Questions are not just about what exists, but about why it was never meant to be seen. And the answers to those questions would eventually lead me to a decision that couldn't be undone. A decision that began forming long before Daniel placed that anniversary gift in front of me. But it would take several more months before I acted on it. Months in which I moved very carefully. Months in which Daniel remained completely unaware that I had seen something he assumed would remain unnoticed. Months in which silence became something more than strategy. It became patience. Because when you understand the full structure of a situation, you don't rush to confront it. You wait. You observe. And you choose the exact moment when clarity turns into action. The moment that came next was the one where I had to decide exactly what kind of person I wanted to be, not in anger, but in truth. For several weeks after I discovered the trust document, I didn't do anything that would have looked unusual to an outside observer. Daniel continued living exactly the same life he had always lived. Morning meetings, evening phone calls, occasional weekend golf games with clients. Our routines remained untouched, but internally, I had reached a quiet crossroads. Because information, once discovered, always demands a response. Not necessarily a dramatic one, but a decision about how you will carry it forward. There were several paths I could have taken. The most obvious one would have been confrontation. I could have walked into the living room one evening, placed the letter on the table, and simply asked, "Who is Lauren Ellis?" It would have been direct, clear, and probably satisfying in the short term. But confrontation also has a way of collapsing situations into immediate reactions. People become defensive. Explanations arrive too quickly. Important details disappear beneath emotion. I didn't want a reaction. I wanted understanding. Another option was to ignore the discovery completely. Pretend I had never seen the document. Trust that whatever Daniel had arranged had a harmless explanation. Many people choose that path when something uncomfortable appears. Silence, after all, can preserve peace, at least temporarily. But ignoring information rarely makes it disappear. It simply leaves you standing on uncertain ground. The third option was more difficult. I could continue gathering context quietly, making sure that I fully understood the implications of what I had seen before taking any visible action. That path required patience, and patience can feel uncomfortable when a question lingers unanswered. But patience also has an advantage. It allows clarity to develop without pressure. So that was the path I chose. Not because I assumed the worst, but because I had spent too many years working in compliance to know how often the first explanation offered in a tense moment turns out to be incomplete. Over the next several months, I watched the structure of our life with slightly different eyes. Not suspicious ones, analytical ones. I reviewed our financial planning more thoroughly than before, met with the advisor I had consulted earlier, asked hypothetical questions about asset separation, trust structures, and long-term legal protections, all framed in neutral terms. Long-term planning, risk management, estate considerations, the kinds of topics that never raise concern when discussed calmly. Daniel didn't question any of it. From his perspective, I was simply doing what I had always done, handling the careful details that supported our life, which meant something important remained true. He still believed the structure around him was stable. That assumption gave me time to understand how the trust is connected to the investment project, time to confirm the legal protections attached to our shared assets, time to quietly adjust certain things so that the future would remain stable regardless of explanations I had not yet heard. Throughout that process, one surprising realization kept returning to me. I wasn't angry. Not the way people expect when they hear a story like this. There was no urge to accuse, no late-night arguments forming in my mind. What I felt instead was something quieter. Detachment. Not from Daniel as a person, but from the assumption that our life operated exactly the way I had believed for 20 years. The discovery of that trust had simply revealed that the structure contained layers I hadn't previously seen. And once you see new layers, you can't return to the original picture. So my decision wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about clarity. About ensuring that whatever truths eventually surfaced, whether simple or complicated, I would be standing on solid ground when they did. That process took time. Nearly a year, in fact. And during that year, something else quietly approached. Our 20th wedding anniversary. Daniel began mentioning it casually about a month beforehand. 20 years, he said one evening while scrolling through his phone. We should probably do something special. I agreed. After 2 decades of marriage, a celebration seemed appropriate. Reservations were made at a restaurant we both liked. A small dinner. Nothing extravagant. Just the two of us. By that point, the questions in my mind had already settled into something calm and steady. I had gathered the information I needed, made the adjustments I felt were necessary. The structure of my future was no longer dependent on assumptions. So when the evening of our anniversary finally arrived, I was prepared for whatever the night might bring. What I didn't expect was it Daniel himself who would place the final piece of the puzzle directly in front of me, wrapped in a small, elegant box, with a gift tag that contained a detail he clearly never intended for me to see. And that tiny detail would turn an ordinary anniversary dinner into a moment neither of us would ever forget. By the time our 20th anniversary arrived, most of the important work had already been done. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. The year between discovering the trust document and sitting down at that restaurant table had been one of the most methodical periods of my life. On the surface, everything remained unchanged. Daniel still believed our financial life operated exactly the way it always had. Friends still saw us as the stable couple who had somehow navigated 2 decades without visible conflict. Even Daniel's parents occasionally joked that we made marriage look effortless. But effortlessness is often just another word for unseen effort. During that year, I had taken a series of small, deliberate steps. None of them is extreme. None of them is impulsive. Each one was simply designed to ensure that my future, whatever shape it eventually took, would no longer depend entirely on assumptions. The first step had been information. Understanding the legal structures surrounding our shared assets, the trust Daniel had created, and the protections already in place. The second step had been consultation. Quiet meetings with professionals who specialize in financial planning and family law. Not dramatic strategy sessions, just calm conversations about how long-term security could be structured more clearly. I never framed those discussions as preparation for a crisis. I framed them as something else. Clarity. Because clarity, in legal and financial matters, rarely raises suspicion. The third step involved something even simpler: documentation. I organized records of every major financial decision we had made over the past 20 years. Investment statements, property documents, partnership agreements. Everything that formed the architecture of our shared life. Not because I expected conflict, but because information is organized calmly in advance tends to prevent confusion later. Through all of this, Daniel remained completely unaware. Not because I was hiding something dramatically, but because nothing I was doing looked unusual to someone who had always seen me as the person who handled details. If anything, he probably assumed I was simply being thorough, which, in a way, was true. The final adjustment came about 3 months before our anniversary. After several quiet consultations, I made a small structural change in how certain assets were protected and documented. Again, nothing aggressive. Just a clearer separation of responsibilities and safeguards. The kind of arrangement that financial advisors often recommend, but that many couples never bother to implement until much later in life. When I mentioned the change to Daniel briefly one evening, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Sounds fine," he said. He trusted me with the details. That trust had always been part of our dynamic. But what Daniel didn't realize was that trust, once paired with careful documentation, creates something very powerful. Stability. And by the time that anniversary dinner approached, I had reached a place of complete calm about the situation. I still didn't know the full explanation behind the trust he had created. I still hadn't asked about Lauren Ellis, but I had something more important than immediate answers. I had prepared. Which meant that whatever truth eventually surfaced, it would no longer have the power to destabilize my life. So when Daniel suggested we celebrate our 20th anniversary at a small waterfront restaurant downtown, I agreed without hesitation. The evening arrived on a warm spring night. Seattle had one of those rare, clear sunsets where the sky turns soft gold over the water. The restaurant was quiet when we arrived. Dim lighting, low conversation. The kind of place designed for long dinners and quiet reflection. Daniel seemed relaxed. Almost unusually so. We ordered wine. Talked about ordinary things. Memories from earlier years of our marriage. At one point, he smiled and said something that, at the time, felt strangely sincere. 20 years is a long time, he said. It is, I agreed. Dinner arrived. The conversation moved easily. And for a while, the evening felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. A quiet celebration. Then, halfway through dessert, Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I got you something," he said. He placed a small, carefully wrapped box on the table. It wasn't large, but it had clearly been chosen with attention. The paper was elegant. The ribbon was tied neatly. At first glance, it looked like the kind of thoughtful gift someone gives after many years of marriage. And for a brief moment, that's exactly what I believed it was. Until I picked it up and noticed the small handwritten tag attached to the ribbon. A tag that contained just a few words. Words that revealed something Daniel clearly hadn't realized before handing it to me. Something that made the rest of our anniversary dinner unfold in a way neither of us had expected. Because the gift itself wasn't the problem. The problem was the name written on the tag. And that name wasn't mine. The tag was small. Just a simple cream-colored card tied neatly beneath the ribbon. Most people probably wouldn't have looked at it twice. But habits formed over the years are difficult to turn off. I read things automatically. Details, labels, names. And the moment my eyes settled on the handwriting, I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just a quiet confirmation of something I had already begun to understand months earlier. The tag read, "For Lauren, with love." For a second, the sounds of the restaurant seemed to soften around me. Not disappear, just fade slightly into the background. Daniel was still talking as I held the box in my hands. Something about how he had found the piece at a boutique jeweler downtown. How it reminded him of a trip we had taken years ago. I listened, calmly, but my attention had moved elsewhere. Because in that moment, two pieces of information that had existed separately in my mind for almost a year suddenly aligned. The trust document and the name written on that gift tag. Lauren. The same name. I turned the tag slightly in the light, reading it again to make sure there was no mistake. The handwriting was clear. Intentional. Not a misprint. Not an accident from the store. Someone had written that name deliberately, and Daniel hadn't noticed before handing the box to me. For a moment, I simply held the gift without opening it. Across the table, Daniel paused mid-sentence. "You're not going to open it?" he asked lightly. I looked up and met his eyes. Of course, I said. My voice sounded exactly the way it always did. Calm. Even. I untied the ribbon slowly and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a bracelet. Thin gold, delicate, elegant in the understated way that Daniel knew I usually preferred. It was beautiful, carefully chosen, which somehow made the moment feel even quieter. Because the object itself wasn't careless. Only the detail attached to it. I closed the box gently and set it on the table. Daniel noticed the tag then. At first, his expression showed simple curiosity, then confusion, and finally something else, a flicker of realization that moved across his face in a way I had never seen before. He reached for the tag quickly. "Wait," he said. His voice had changed slightly. I didn't interrupt. He turned the card over in his hands, staring at the name written there as if it had appeared from nowhere. That's not," he began. The words stopped halfway. For the first time in 20 years, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain in front of me. Not defensive, not angry. Just caught off guard. And the interesting thing was that I didn't feel the surge of emotion that movies often portray in moments like this. No raised voice, no accusations. Because by that point, I had already spent an entire year understanding the structure of the situation. The gift tag had simply confirmed something I already knew existed. Across the table, Daniel finally looked back up at me. "I think the jeweler must have..." He stopped again. Even he seemed to realize how unlikely that explanation sounded. The silence between us lasted several seconds. But it wasn't tense. It was something else. Clarity settling into the space between two people who suddenly understood that a long-standing assumption had just broken open. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. "I can explain," he said. I believed him. Not because I trusted the explanation, but because explanations always exist. People rarely do things without reason. The real question is whether those reasons change anything about the structure surrounding them. And in this case, the structure had already changed long before that dinner. I placed my hands calmly on the table. "Daniel," I said gently. "Yes?" I held his gaze. "You don't need to explain anything tonight." The surprise in his expression deepened. "But it's our anniversary," I continued quietly. "Let's finish dinner." He looked at me as if trying to understand what I meant. Perhaps he expected anger or confrontation. But the truth was simpler than that. The consequences of this moment had already begun long before he placed that box in front of me. They had begun the day I discovered the trust. And during the year that followed, I had quietly ensured that whatever explanation Daniel eventually offered, it would arrive far too late to change the decisions already set in motion. That evening, we finished dinner politely. We talked about neutral things. The weather, travel plans, a documentary Daniel had recently watched. To anyone observing us from across the room, we probably looked like a couple enjoying a quiet anniversary. And in some ways, we were. Because that dinner marked the final moment of a version of our marriage that had existed for 20 years. By the time we left the restaurant that night, the consequences had already begun unfolding. Daniel just didn't realize it yet. But over the next few weeks, small changes would start appearing around him. Changes he wouldn't immediately understand. Changes that would slowly reveal how much of our life had quietly depended on the person he had always assumed would remain exactly where she was. Reliable. Quiet. Permanent. Until she wasn't. For the first few days after our anniversary dinner, Daniel behaved as if the situation could still be corrected with a simple explanation. He was unusually attentive, more present at home, more careful with his words. The bracelet box remained on the dresser in our bedroom, unopened since the restaurant. Neither of us mentioned it again immediately, but silence has a way of making certain realities impossible to ignore. 3 days later, Daniel finally approached the subject. It was early evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a set of documents for work when he walked in and closed the door behind him. "Elysia," he said. His voice carried a tone I hadn't heard from him before. Something between nervousness and urgency. "I think we need to talk about what happened at the restaurant." I closed my laptop gently. "All right." He sat across from me. For a moment, he didn't speak. He seemed to be organizing his thoughts, the way people do when they're trying to control the direction of a conversation. "The tag," he began carefully. "That was a mistake." I nodded slightly. "Maybe," I said. His eyes searched my face. "You don't seem surprised." That observation hung in the air for a moment. Because it was true. I didn't look shocked. I didn't look angry. And that was confusing for him. "What exactly would you like to explain, Daniel?" I asked calmly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "There's a project I've been involved in," he said. "One of the development partnerships I mentioned last year." I listened. "There's someone connected to that project," he continued. "Lauren Ellis. She's an investor's daughter. I helped mentor her a bit when she started working in the industry." The explanation came carefully, measured, as if he were choosing each detail with extreme caution. "The trust you probably found," he added slowly. So he knew, at least part of the story. "That was structured around the project," he said. "Some of the equity was placed under her name for tax reasons." I remained quiet, because explanations are interesting not only for what they say, but also for what they avoid saying. Daniel noticed the silence stretching between us. "I should have told you about it," he added quickly. "I realize that now." "Yes," I said softly. "You probably should have." The room grew quiet again. He looked relieved for a moment, as if the conversation had reached the point where problems usually begin resolving. But then I spoke again. "Daniel," I said gently, "do you remember something you told me a few weeks ago?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You said 20 years is a long time." He nodded slowly. "Yes." "I agree," I said. Another pause. Then I continued. 20 years is also enough time to understand the structure of your own life." Confusion flickered across his face. "I'm not sure I follow." That was the moment I realized something important. Daniel still believed this conversation was about explanations, about repairing trust, about correcting a mistake. He didn't yet understand that the structure of our marriage had already shifted long before that dinner. "I'm not asking you to explain the trust," I said quietly. "You're not?" "No." "Then what are you asking?" I met his eyes. Nothing. That single word seemed to land heavier than anything else I could have said. Because people expect questions when something goes wrong. Questions create the possibility of answers, and answers create the possibility of repair. But the absence of questions means something different. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "Elysia, what does that mean?" I folded my hands on the table. "It means that whatever explanation exists," I said calmly, "it's arriving very late." His expression changed again. No confusion this time. Concern. "Late for what?" I stood up and walked toward the kitchen counter, pouring myself a glass of water before answering. Because some truths deserve to be delivered slowly. Late for decisions that have already been made. When I turned back toward him, I saw something new in his face. A realization is beginning to form. "What decisions?" he asked quietly. I took a sip of water. Then I said something that shifted the entire conversation into a place he hadn't anticipated. "The ones that began the day I discovered the trust." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier pauses. This time it carried weight, because Daniel had just realized something he had never considered before. That the quiet person sitting across from him had been aware of far more than he had assumed, and that the calmness he had interpreted as patience might actually have been preparation. For the first time since our anniversary dinner, Daniel looked genuinely unsettled. Not because of the trust, not because of the gift tag, but because he had suddenly understood something much more important. Whatever explanation he offered now, it might already be too late to change the outcome.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.